Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad I'm coming. I'm not standing between you and lunch. I'm glad you've all had lunch. It's okay if some of you want to take a cat nap. I certainly won't be offended. Thank you, President Lewis, for the kind introduction. It was such a pleasure working under your leadership as part of the NYSBA Task Force on Advancing Diversity, which you put together in the immediate aftermath of the Supreme Court's decision in SFFA versus Harvard and UNC. It was co-chaired, of course, by Paul Weiss Chair Brad Karp, former Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson, and former Attorney General Loretta Lynch. And for you to be able to draw those people together in the immediate aftermath of the decision and to be able to produce that report under your leadership in such a truncated time frame, I think is a real reflection of the exceptional leader that you are. I also want to thank and acknowledge the Task Force on Racism, Social Equity, and the Law, and past NYSBA President Andrew Brown for initiating and putting together this report and symposium in order to mobilize our collective efforts towards addressing racial and social barriers. Former President Brown has been a mentor to me, and his devotion to this organization is really the reason that I initially joined. So thank you so much, former President Brown. And finally, I want to thank Albany Law School President and Dean Cinnamon Carlane and Government Law Center Director Judge Leslie Stein for hosting us today. It's such a pleasure to be here. And finally, I want to thank all of you for joining me today. It's humbling to be in a room surrounded by such exceptional talent. It's particularly humbling to be with a group of people, all of whom are like-minded in their courageous mindset, because you need courage to address and tackle the really hard issues that have been discussed during this symposium. And now I want to turn to the keynote. I had a hard time thinking of a great title for this keynote, so I settled instead on this quote from President Biden that's, I think, been up there for 20 minutes now. So I assume all of you have read it and are familiar with it. It resonates with a story that I'm going to tell you today. Now, I think you've probably heard throughout this conference from a lot of terrific and brilliant intellectuals. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my story. And I'm going to start by, I have this quote up by President Biden because when I read it last year, it really struck a chord with me. And I'll just read it for those of you that haven't read it. He said, "We're the only country built on an idea. The idea that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. We've never fully lived up to it, but we've never walked away from it either." The Declaration of Independence indeed provides that all men are created equal. But we know when that was written, it was a fallacy. Because when the U.S. Constitution came into play, as the task force pointed out, only 20% of the American population experienced true equality and full citizenship. Right? The 20% of America that was comprised of white men who owned property. The story I'm going to tell you today is deeply personal and focuses on my lifelong quest to learn how the concept of equality and equity are interpreted throughout the world and ponder why true equality remains an elusive concept. As Dr. Paula Johnson, the professor of law at Syracuse University, who spoke at the task force's first public forum, said, and I quote, "Debates as to principles of equality versus principles of equity should be viewed thusly. Equality says that everyone should be treated the same, get the same, no matter what their starting point or material conditions. However, equity demands that we realize that what is equal is not necessarily equitable." As we reflect on the words of Dr. Johnson and President Biden, I want to ask you two simple questions. One, why are you here today? Outside of CLE credit, why are you here today? And secondly, why are we gathering as a community today? Let me try to answer the second question. Though we all come from different backgrounds, we are all here with a shared vision and commitment for change. Everyone has a unique story in this room, a story that can make a fundamental difference in the lives of somebody else. My first job out of law school, or one of my first jobs, was clerking for former Chief Judge Roger L. Gregory, the grandson of sharecroppers. Believe it or not, he was the first person of color in almost 2 centuries, 180 years, to become a judge on the prestigious Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. His life story, his ability to overcome enormous challenges and beat seemingly insurmountable odds, changed my perspective on what is possible when you have an unquenchable desire to succeed. And I stand here in large part because of him. And therefore, I encourage all of you to share your story, to talk about the challenges you have faced and overcome in order to achieve your success. Now that I've asked you for a favor, I want to practice what I preach and share a piece of my journey with you. A journey that has been filled with peaks and valleys, villains and heroes, but has allowed me to view equality from the vantage point of several cultures, from India to South Africa to Flint, Michigan, and to see how the fight for equality is one that is not uniquely American. I didn't grow up wanting to be a lawyer. I actually wanted to be a football player. But then life and an immense lack of athletic talent intervened. So in lieu of throwing touchdowns or catching touchdowns, I've spent my career devoted to addressing issues of equality and equity and working on how to level the playing field in a society that, as we all know, often allocates resources and benefits based on stereotypes deriving from race, gender, socioeconomic status, and yes, even caste. I was born in India, a place where a person's destiny and job is often predetermined by the caste they are born into. My preordained caste should have sentenced me to a life with very little choice and taken away my free will to determine my life's purpose. But one of my heroes, there's one of my heroes. Well, 2 of my heroes, that was Judge Gregory, who is back there. You could put him up for a minute, whoever is controlling the slides. That's Judge Gregory, and as you can see, he was appointed back in 2000 and served as the chief judge until 2023. Anyway, one of my heroes, another one of my heroes, my grandmother, and her unwavering commitment to education changed my life's trajectory and made caste irrelevant. My grandmother was a second mother to me. She was a product of the early 20th century, right around World War I. She was born in a country where the pernicious combination of racial, caste, and gender discrimination proved to be insurmountable for many Indian women. Yet despite enormous odds, through sheer perseverance and grit, she went to college and graduated with a degree in education. One of the first women in that country to get a degree in education. My mother followed suit, inspired by my grandmother, also graduating with a degree in education and becoming the first Asian principal in a small town in eastern Florida, best known for playing host to the Kennedy Space Center. My mom has been a principal at a public school for 30 years. That public school is located in an underserved community. Every night when I was a kid at home, I would hear my mom talking about what her kids needed. That's what she calls her children. All of her students she refers to as her kids. And there would be daily conversations about what kids needed housing, what kids needed school supplies, what kids needed food, what kids and their guardians needed health care because they didn't have insurance. And sometimes it was simply which kids needed a reassuring voice that their dreams remained within reach, despite the enormous obstacles that they faced. What I didn't know then, but I do know now, is these conversations were an introduction to the effects of structural inequality. Inspired by my grandmother and my mother, I began to wrestle with a question that I still grapple with as we sit here today. How can I make the world a more equitable and equal place? My parents are first-generation immigrants. Although my father is an engineer, he didn't speak English very well. So when he immigrated to this country in 1973, he spent the first few years of his life waking up at 6 a.m. in the morning, walking to the garments district, and laying out a blanket where he would sell pens on the street of New York City. And he sold a lot of pens. And if you ever have any questions of pens, about pens, what the best pens are, what colors last the longest, let me know. I'll hook you up with my father. Once he developed his language skills, he was able to obtain an engineering job in Detroit, Michigan. Growing up in Detroit, I didn't think much about race. In some ways, I didn't know what race really meant because I was surrounded by people of color. In 1989, my father got the call that he'd been waiting for his whole life. He initially immigrated to America because he saw it as a land of opportunity. He saw John F. Kennedy's speech about going to the moon, and he knew right then and there that he had to make it to America. And lucky for him, America was having a green card lottery for engineers, and he won the lottery. And 20 some odd years later, he got the call from NASA, and we moved to that small town in Florida. Before we got to Florida, we didn't have a lot of money. So there was really no option or even thought about buying a home. But when we got to Florida, we all of a sudden got some money. And the first thing my parents wanted to do in pursuit of their American dream was to buy a house, their own little piece of America. So they found a house that they wanted, and the house was accepted. Or the offer for the house was accepted. When the seller of the house finally met my father, he was shocked. So my father and I had met him on the day of closing. We walked in, and I saw the look on the seller's face. It was a look of sheer terror. And he whispered something to his realtor, who then came to my father and said in sum and substance, the house is no longer for sale because he doesn't sell to people that look like us. So you saw my name on the screen. My last name is Longani. What you don't know is my father's first name is Hans. If you hadn't met me and I had just told you my dad's name is Hans Longani, you might have expected a white, Italian, or German man to walk through the door. But my dad is not Italian, although he loves Italian food. He is a dark-skinned, brown man, and I have a picture of him, but maybe it'll get up there. There he is. There's my dad. I remember two things from that day. One, I remember my father's face if I could draw, and I can't, I don't have an artistic bone in my body, I could draw that face today. It is frozen in my mind. That feeling of helplessness, despair, concepts that I really was unaware of at that stage in my life. The second thing I remember is the sense of hopelessness that came over me. There was nothing I could do in that moment to fix this injustice. We just couldn't buy the house, and that was the end of the story. That moment triggered a lifelong commitment to understanding equality, and racial equality in particular, that, unknown to me at the time, led to me becoming a lawyer. So I went to law school, and I set out to study equality in other cultures. First stop on that journey was South Africa. I wanted to see how other societies outside of the United States defined equality, and I had the opportunity to work with the late, great Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And I went to South Africa to work on the post-apartheid constitution and answer the question, how do you even attempt to level the playing field in a society where people of color were not allowed equal opportunities for hundreds of years? A familiar question that many of us in this room grapple with every day. The answer to that question, at least in South Africa in the moment, was a new constitution, and I was one of the people lucky enough to get to work on the new constitution and hear extraordinary minds talk about things like the right to housing, the right to medical care, and most importantly, the right to education. These are fundamental rights that are in the South African Constitution. And I remember the Archbishop talking about education in particular because he remembered that the apartheid South African government had found that denying people of color an equal opportunity to an education, a basic education, was key to remaining in power. So on one hand, it was thrilling to be a part of the process of developing the most progressive constitution in the world. But unfortunately, like many cultures, the law's requirement for true equality, while it was in theory in the Constitution, it didn't translate to reality, and South Africa continues to be rife with educational inequities. But these type of historical educational inequities persist not only in South Africa, but as the president just said, here as well, in New York State, as the task force so eloquently set out. After I left South Africa, I wanted to further explore inequality in the United States. So I went to work for the late, great Elijah Cummings in Washington, D.C. And I served as chief counsel to Chairman Cummings when he was chair, ranking member at that time, eventually chair of the House Oversight Committee. Chairman Cummings taught me a lot of things. He taught me how inequality was not limited to countries with less resources than us, like India and South Africa. He also taught me that it is our collective responsibility, all of us, to hold our government accountable. And when he referred to us, he wasn't talking about famous electeds. He was talking about people like you and me. Flint, Michigan is and continues to be a segregated city. And that was not a historical accident. We all know that where you live can have a major impact upon your physical health, but I naively always assumed that our government would do everything in its power to protect the American people. As Abraham Lincoln once said, the role of government is to do for people what they cannot do for themselves. This sentiment is why so many of us commit a part or all of our lives to public service. But my assumption regarding our government was sorely tested when Chairman Cummings asked me to lead the investigation into the Flint water crisis. Due to the malfeasance of Michigan's governor, thousands of black children were poisoned by their very own government. For years and years, they drank brown, toxic sludge. During our investigation, we discovered that not only did the governor of Michigan know that the water from the Flint River was poisoning the residents of Flint, but had the unmitigated gall to face the residents of Flint and tell the horrific lie that their water was clean and safe to drink, despite the obvious health consequences that these people were facing. As a result of this negligence, there are a generation of children in Flint who will grow up not being able to read See, Spot, Run on account of the neurological damage that they sustained from drinking that sludge. Flint was a tragic example of our government treating its citizens unequally. And under the leadership of Chairman Cummings, it was our job to attempt to remedy that injustice in some way. As the chairman said, this is not American. But I'd rather you hear that from him than from me. Could you play that, please?
The entire operation of Flint. Now let me ask you something else. Are the people paying right now in Flint for water they cannot wash in and cannot use and cannot drink? Are they paying water bills? And is it a part of the recovery? You said you want to make them whole. Is that part of it? Why would they be paying more for water that they cannot even use that is a poison to them? That's not American.
Look, Flint didn't happen overnight, and even though Brown legally mandated the desegregation of Flint, there remained, as Michigan itself said through its Civil Rights Commission, quote, structural and systemic discrimination that corroded your city, your institutions, and your water pipes for generations. I remember in one of the moments after this hearing where we had Governor Snyder under oath, I was feeling really dispirited, and the chairman came up to me and said, every time something bad happens to me, I don't ask the question, why did it happen to me? The question I asked is, why did it happen for me? So why did we go through this experience? The only positive takeaway from this unfathomable tragedy, from my perspective, is that when you get a determined group of people who share the mindset that fairness, equity, and equality are moral goals that cannot be compromised, even under the most trying circumstances, we can and must hold our government accountable. And in Flint, while justice and equality did not magically appear overnight, the impossible became somewhat possible. Today in Flint, every house has brand new pipes and clean water, and the governor was charged with two misdemeanor counts for willful neglect of duty. After I left Washington, D.C., I continued on to my equality journey, and I went to New York City and became chief counsel to former Mayor Bill de Blasio. I worked for Bill de Blasio because he campaigned on a vision of remedying inequality in New York City. And he greenlighted the creation of a racial justice commission. And I was honored to be a joint appointment by the chair of that commission, the great Jennifer Jones Austin, and the mayor, to serve as a senior advisor to the Racial Justice Commission. I advised the commission on how to begin remedying centuries of inequities in New York City. And similar to South Africa, we began that process of trying to level the playing field by reworking the city's constitution, otherwise known as its charter. The first thing we did was add a preamble to the city's charter to help guide New York City government in fulfilling its duties and focus on defining our values, which include a just and equitable city for all. I've got some of the quotes from the preamble there. I'll only read a couple. One of the provisions I'm most proud of is, and I quote, "We, the people of New York City, declare that our city is a multiracial democracy and that our diversity is our strength." And the preamble also required the city to strive to remedy past and continuing harms, to promote justice and equity for all New Yorkers. The commission also created the Office of Racial Equity and appointed a chief equity officer to advance racial equity and coordinate the city's racial equity planning process. When Mayor de Blasio's term ended, I continued my work at the State University of New York, where I currently serve as the Senior Vice Chancellor for Legal Affairs and General Counsel for the 64 campuses across the state. I'm grateful to work for an organization that has the same core values as I do as a public servant, an immigrant, and a lawyer. The mission at SUNY, the mission of the Chancellor and the Board of Trustees, is to provide equal access to education to every New Yorker. You can see our mission statement up there. Education, I believe, is the ultimate leveler of the playing field, and that is why it is such a great honor to work for Chancellor John King and the SUNY Board of Trustees, and in particular, Chair Merrill Tisch, people who've dedicated their careers to leveling the playing field in education. John King is another hero of mine. He's an example of someone like my grandmother who overcame unimaginable odds to become the Secretary of Education and Chancellor at SUNY. His journey should be a beacon of hope for all of us. He often credits public schools for saving his life after he lost his parents. And his life story has all the makings of a Hollywood blockbuster. Hopefully, they can get Dave Patel from Slumdog Millionaire to play me when the movie gets made. As you see in our mission statement, SUNY welcomes all students and is committed to breaking down barriers to build a more diverse and inclusive environment. As the Chancellor has said, we'll put his quote up here in a minute, at SUNY we know that uncomfortable truths are often the ones most deserving of discussion. We understand that this nation's historical and continuing struggles with systemic bigotry, prejudice, persecution, and exclusion must be reckoned with to overcome. In Florida, Texas, and other states, craven politicians now seek to ban diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is to say they are banning truth. They are engaged in an egregious assault on academic freedom, the mission of higher education, and the strength of our democracy. As soon as I got to SUNY, the Chancellor pulled me aside and said, "Kapil, we're grappling with major policy decisions relating to equity, including the Supreme Court decision, or soon-to-be decision, on race-conscious admissions." And we started to ask ourselves questions like, how can we ensure that equality continues to exist on our campuses? What are we doing in higher education to ensure that everyone has access to a terrific quality education? In the immediate aftermath of the Supreme Court, our board issued a statement saying in part that the pursuit of diversity, equity, and inclusion within the law will always be integral to ensuring that SUNY is the best statewide public system of higher education in the country. Not too long after that, I was asked to give the James Otis Lecture in Buffalo. I spoke to about 100 underrepresented minority high school students in 11th and 12th grade. And the Supreme Court decision, which had just come out a couple of months before, was at the top of their mind. They wanted to know, what does this decision mean for me? Is the Supreme Court saying that race doesn't matter? Is it saying that the challenges that I have overcome, partially on account of my race, are irrelevant? I will tell you what I told them. Contrary to what those in the media have said, the court never said that race is irrelevant or that the admissions process should be race blind. But don't take my word for it. Here's Justice Roberts' words, right? Nothing in this opinion should be construed as prohibiting universities from considering an applicant's discussion of how race affected his or her life, be it through discrimination, inspiration, or otherwise. The court, of course, went on to distinguish considerations of an applicant's experiences as an individual from the impermissible consideration of an applicant solely on the basis of their race. And so we come full circle. At the beginning of my talk, I asked you to talk about your life story because it matters. The Supreme Court, in my mind, in my interpretation, reiterated that your story continues to matter and explicitly agreed that part of your story includes the color of your skin and the experiences we've had as a result of that. White, brown, black, purple. It was a real honor to meet these talented students in Buffalo. And it was ironic that we were having this discussion in Buffalo. As you all know, the history of segregation in schools and the court order that led to Buffalo becoming a national model for integration symbolizes the power of the law to effectuate change. Now, we all know there were steps taken backward, right? We know the 80s and 90s were terrific for integration in Buffalo. We also know there have been steps that have, taken a few steps backward in that respect, but that doesn't change the fact that it was the law that effectuated that change. Long overdue change, but nevertheless, there was change. And so whether at SUNY, at your organizations, in your jobs and life, in my job, in our collective work, legally and otherwise, we must continue to work to level the playing field for everyone. There remain so many inequities in housing, education, healthcare. It is incumbent on all of us here today to make sure that we continue to work on these issues to remedy these inequities. Centuries of persistent advocacy by civil rights heroes like John Lewis, Cesar Chavez, Fred Korematsu, Dalip Singh, and some whose names have been lost in history, like my grandmother. People who have faced what appeared to be insurmountable obstacles prove that despite long odds, nothing is truly impossible. I'm going to end by showing you a picture of me standing in front of the house we eventually did buy in Florida. And why am I showing that picture to you? Because if I could talk to that kid 4 decades ago, I would tell him that you're going to meet a lot of people in your life who believe in true equality. They will judge you on the content of your character and help you reach places you couldn't even dream of. Just make sure you do the same for others. Show them that sometimes human beings and the laws that we create and interpret fall short. But that doesn't mean we give up. So that's the end of my story. But I'm going to end with 2 pearls of wisdom from my hero, Chairman Cummings. He once said, "I'm here for a season and a reason. I don't know why I'm here. I don't know how long I'll be here, but I'm here. And I'm going to make the best of it." And I remember the last time I met him, the second quote I have up here, he said something very similar. He says, I try to remind people that there are a lot of good people, all colors. Then there's some bad ones too. But there's a lot of good people who really care. I think my former boss would agree with me when I say that the people in this room are the good people he was referring to. It's because you all care so deeply that we will continue to make our country a truly more equal and equitable place for all of us. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.